Brian.
How are you doing, sir?
I'm good. It's in the 60s today here in Philadelphia. It looks like spring has sprung. Crocuses are popping up. I forgot that's a thing on the East Coast. You
Right.
don't get a lot of that in New Mexico.
Yeah, no, our apricot trees are actually cracking some. I took a picture of a couple flowers today
Awesome.
that
So now you're really hoping for no late freeze.
yeah, and it's been a weird year. We had a real early snow. We just had a snow a day or two ago. It has snowed here as late as May.
Yeah.
I'll usually won't stick, but so yeah, it's always hard to tell. Very
Yeah.
few years do we not get a freeze that kills the buds for the apricots. But then I did have apricots last year. I had a number of them. And then I also had even more squirrels, and not a single apricot made it past the squirrels.
Ah, bummer.
S
Because New Mexico apricots are amazing for making jam and stuff like that. I've been fortunate enough to have friends with surpluses and have done a bunch of jam making in a few years. Especially if you get plums in the same year, apricot plum is an amazing combination.
Oh, nice. Yeah, and those were brought here, I believe, by the Spanish, in the early colonias, los colonias. I remember that was one of
The
the things they brought was,
1600s.
yeah, fruit trees, and now they've adapted to this climate.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, very nice.
So I have a little weave of topics that I thought might get us started today. So let me just lay out. I think it's two or three things.
Sure.
One is I keep thinking about Jordan Peterson. I think in a lecture of his, he talks about how the reason free speech is so important is because you can't have free thought without it, and without free thought mankind's potential is just limited. And what's interesting to me about that now is not just the idea itself, although I think it's a really important idea, but it's that comment illustrates the connection between psychology and philosophy in a way. Because the statement about free thought being required for human success and free speech underpinning that implies one, a semantic world that requires language and meaning, or language to contain meaning. And then also this connection between, I'm thinking of Descartes' I think, therefore I am. Well, what circumscribes your thinking defines who you are, right? And so there's like uh, I don't know if I'm describing that well enough, but this link between psychology and philosophy.
Sure.
The other thread that has come up for me lately that is kind of tangentially connected to that is psychodynamics in organizations, because I'm in the market now for consulting work, for adding new clients, and I have a lot of opportunities to give people advice about the solar market. But what's much more interesting to me often is helping them grow healthy organizations. And that's like a different type of engagement. And
Sure.
helping them with growing a healthy organization would give them the resilience to deal with all of the intense changes in the solar market. And it's more and more clear to me that working in the arena of building healthy organizations is about working on the individual and collective psychology of the organization.
Sure.
So even though leaders might want kind of tactical or even strategic input, cultural input, or where psychology, individual and collective, lives, is often where the greatest leverage point might be. So there's
Sure.
kind of like
Sure.
philosophy, psychology, and organizations all on my mind, and I thought that might get us started somewhere interesting.
Yeah. The image that I came away with right away, because I often think in metaphors, was I started a flashback to a woodshop experience, which is that I was used to building furniture. And so we have drawers and we have doors and we have the basic physics or organization of how these things go together. It's very traditional. It hasn't changed a lot for a long period of time. You want it to be stable, right? You want it to be square and plumb and perpendicular and all that, which is all well and good. And it kind of comes out of our mind because you don't find that anywhere in nature. There's nothing square or plumb or, nature just does its deal. And then I built a boat. And all of a sudden, the same thing will happen to a degree if you build chairs, but a boat is like everything's different. And when you started talking about an organization, I started thinking about building a boat because one of the things that you notice about building a boat is that the lines need to be organic, right? Because I'm not building this thing, this object to exist in a stable, static environment, which is the way that we naturally think. I'm building something that's got to handle a current, that's got to work in the wind, that's going to have a draft. It's going to have a capacity of what it can carry, but it's also got to be maneuverable in a certain way. And then when I get it bigger and bigger, now I have to have a crew of people that can make this boat perform. And it's got to perform in the calm, and it's got to perform in the shallows, and it's got to perform in the winds, and it's got to perform with ice. And all of these different capacities have to somehow be fused together in an organic way, not in a conceptual way, which is kind of the way that we tend to come at things. Organic designs introduce very specific kinds of problems. And sometimes the tools that we have are not equipped, or the way that we're used to using the tools are not equipped to pull off organic designs, right? Things that flow inside of an environment. So that's my big metaphorical snapshot. So, you can drill down into parts of that, and I think there are good metaphorical takeaways. But if we think about human consciousness now in light of that, there's some useful things that come out of that, right? Everybody on the boat, we're all trying to get somewhere together. We're also all interdependent. We also know there's a possibility of people falling off the boat. We also know that not all crew members pull at the oar the same way. We also know that some of the crew come with radically different attitudes about the whole enterprise. uh, you know, some might be happy to sail where it's warm and really become uncooperative when you're sailing into the cold. Again, I'm just trying to stretch this metaphor every which way, but you can see there's like no shortage of ways that applies, because then we naturally end up as, what's a good ship designer? What's a good captain? What's a good first mate? What's a good sailor? How do we pick a crew? How do we train a crew? How do we adjust when we hit circumstances that are not typical, like a storm or the doldrums, both of which are problems for a business, right? If we translate that, or the ice, God forbid, or pirates, or so yeah, that's the second question, maybe. The first question about, where I went right off is the way I've been, in the conversations in my head that I've been having with myself that are around the sacredness of language. This mystical idea that shows up not only in archeologos, not only the beginning was the word, but the word was made flesh. Now you can get you can attribute this to one individual, which a lot of Christian groups do, but you can also say that this has something to do with, like this Taoist idea of man being a partner to heaven and earth. And if earth is the mater, right, the matter, then the form is what comes from heaven. That's the world of meaning. That's the world of the world of meaning is the world of language. We've talked about that quite a bit. So to me, the sacredness of language is like The idea that you wouldn't have free speech is someone putting their metaphorical hands around your metaphorical throat and choking off your metaphorical carotid arteries, because what it is to move in the world through the medium of language and meaning. And censorship is one half of ways that that gets throttled. The other way, which I also curiously was thinking about, and I was listening to some people talk about today, which had to do with lying. Before language, there's no lying. I mean, maybe that's not technically true, but what they were going into was the difference between animals being deceptive and humans being deceptive. And yes, animals are deceptive, and yes, humans are way better at it than any animal could ever hope to be. So,
I mean, really, almost the default condition for humans. Like, everybody is somewhat deceptive and self-deceptive even.
well, and as we've spoken before, speaking the exact truth may well be impossible. If the exact truth is the actual coastline of Norway, and all we have to speak are these estimations at different resolutions, then the words which can be spoken are not the true words. The names which can be given are not the true names. This is the first passage in the Tao Te Ching, chapter 1, sentence 1 and 2. Right? So we can't work without this in is to some degree inaccurate map. But we've adapted to that map, right? We use that map. Our ordinary existence relies on that map in a way that Husserl called natural attitude, the pre-philosophical condition. We're not worrying about whether this chair I'm sitting on actually exists. We're not worrying about the big question. We're worrying about whether we've got eggs and bread, right? And so there is this idea of a natural attitude, and that is to live through this mental model. What Husserl, the same guy, called the Lebenswelt, right, or the life world, which is to say the world as we inhabit and experience it. So that is becomes that representational, because that Lebenswelt is everything we've accumulated on top of that initial condition of our foot nailed down, right? That hermeneutical circle that we keep updating with every day of experience, that picture of the whole is the world that we live in the world of meaning, right? So now for anybody, we know already that when we've talked already about, and maybe I haven't made this clear enough. I should say this. We talked about the difference between rhetoric and dialect. And there's this idea that dialect can find the truth, whereas rhetoric, because is about emotions and it's about persuasion. It's not about finding truth necessarily. And so something else has to happen. This dialectic has to happen uh, for truth to be uncovered. So the idea of misinformation, the idea of censorship, which are kind of like the two things. You can't say this, or saying something that's not true. Yeah, intentionally saying something that's not true, as opposed to the fact that it's just difficult to say true things. And those are like things that show up with language. This is like the devil that comes in the back door with this great beneficent, right? So the beneficent gift that is language. To finish that thought. So, yeah, and how we harmonize those worlds, how we share those worlds, how we fuse the horizons of those worlds, how we build groups of affiliation. And we've talked about a lot of this stuff. So, to bring it down into organizations, There's a lot of thoughts. We've talked, for example, about diversity, and you absolutely do want diversity. Why? Because your catcher can't have the same skill set as your first baseman, or else both of them will do a mediocre job. You want the catcher to be somebody who's been brought with the mentality of a catcher and the training of a catcher and the sensibilities of a catcher that's so different than left field or the pitcher, right? And a team obviously needs to be balanced with all these diverse skills and sets, and yet they must play as a team. It's obviously the priority. If you're in the ship, obviously the crew has to all be steering the ship in the same direction. You can't have people throwing stuff overboard. You can't, so, yeah, what does that all come down to? It comes down to the fusing of horizons. The more our horizons have fused, the more we're capable of sharing the same life world and of sharing the same goals and of driving the ship in the same direction. And and that is by definition a sort of a lack of diversity, right? Because we're all focused on this one thing, and for this one thing to hold significance, it's got to live within this world of meaning that we all share. And yeah, and now that has to live in the stream, right? Because this boat isn't just a boat sitting on shore for people to admire. You got to be able to dock it, you got to be able to load it, you got to be able to sail it in a storm. And so what does that storm represent? It's going to represent the market. It's also going to represent, all the other sea traffic and all the realities that go along with that and clearing all the obstacles. And then the fact that once you have a good crew member, he's also valuable to other ships. And so yeah, I mean, there's a lot, and then there's the whole. This all sits within the context of with humans, with the humanities, with things working in this way. Can we just go build things like we can when we're building a house or a piece of furniture, or are we more in a situation like bonsai? Where we've got this natural thing that has its tendency to want to do certain things. And we're going to kind of shape it this way and maybe nip it here a little bit and maybe kind of put it in a setting that brings out and enhances the natural qualities that it show, all this
That last one is more and more how I think of it. And I think of this as like a blatant yin and yang dichotomy where we could try to make something happen, or we can work on the container and see what happens. And more, I default to the latter. That the culture, the environment, the way we communicate, the ceremonies and rituals that an organization has create the container from which culture emerges and then from which action emerges.
right,
So,
right.
yeah. Just to maybe for the soundbite, maybe not. It sounds like you're a free speech absolutist. Do you think there should be any limitations on speech in society?
Um, well, the classic limitation that everybody brings up is shouting fire in a theater. And that becomes a metaphor for intentionally using language to create a violent or bad outcome. I think that there's two questions here. One is where is the line? And the other one is who gets to decide where the line is and enforce it. And if either one of those questions is insoluble, then you have a trouble moving past that because we quickly end up with sedition acts. And I think that our founders they understood about a thing that happens with humans. It isn't just again we talked about this. We got the theoretical realm and then we have the practical realm. And a good plan might use the theoretical for its bigger picture questions, but it's got to be rooted in the practical so that it can handle the realities that are necessary to be handled to be successful in the larger outcome. And so there is this pragmatic wisdom and theoretical wisdom that both have to marry and have a dialectic between them, right? And that's probably what needs to be mirrored within an organization. But again, that organization has to sort of sit within a setting. It, for the organization to have meaning, it has to have sit within a context. Because for anything to have meaning, it has to sit within a context. And how the people that are in that organization see that context is almost a step before how they see themselves within it. And that's why you get organizations that only hire from one political party, or you start to import cultural issues without really knowing that that's what you're doing. But to build a cohesive picture of who we are, we kind of have to make some assumptions about the setting we are amongst. And that's where things get tricky.
It's interesting to me to think of an organization having to exist in a context in order to have meaning, because those aren't organizational words.
Right.
They're philosophical words, and so I'm trying to translate them into from within an organization. What does that practically mean? And I think one way of interpreting it is in order for a coherent strategy to exist, the strategy has to be relevant to the world outside the organization. But you also get the what you said about the context of the organization might be more important than the context of any individual living in the organization or participating in the organization in terms of the outcome, the desired outcome being the organization's success.
Right.
And so that creates an interesting interplay between part and whole, that we have to participate in. We kind of unwittingly do it when we're in a family, but in an organization, we're making a choice to straddle this partness and wholeness that we're embodying. And that goes to, the catcher and the pitcher having different skills, right? Each being a part, one would expect that, but also being part of a whole, the team being the most important thing. Um, and yeah, it makes me curious about organizations as kind of evolutionary entities that demonstrate our interdependence. And like it's kind of like to exist in a family, in a community, or in an organization, in some interdependent group is evolutionarily more developed than existing independently. It's more of that dependence, independence, interdependence continuum as an evolutionary statement. Just some musings.
Yeah, yeah, perhaps. And because modern culture is such a complex system, those things start to overlap as we are members of different groups. And it can be, tricky for people when they're members of groups and those groups subscribe to slightly different, collective life worlds. And for example, people are members of a religious community, and then maybe they also work for a certain company. And the company might have one set of values, the religious community might have another set of values. And then the person there is caught in between, which the more complex the modern world becomes, the more those double bind situations will likely arise. And this gets into that group identity, us, them, and where each person is within that. I think that what comes down as maybe a tangential, but it seems to me inescapable conclusion, which is been my one string banjo song, which is that all these things are improved as the quality of communication and discourse improves. And that there's probably some parameters that go along with that, like the ability for an organization to harbor radical honesty, uh, and, and that's where, again, it comes down to different organizations are organized around different agendas and different goals. And those are the things that really those goals are what source everything that follows them. Uh, so there's this idea also within philosophy that also came out of Husserl, which is this idea of intentionality and how fundamental intentionality is for us to be within a setting for like that intentionality is what relates us to the outside, because intentionality, for us to for consciousness to move, it always moves towards something. There's always a referent. You can't be a subject without being referential to an object. An object has to be a subject of something to be an object. And so we're into this interplay of intentionality, and I think that if we step it up, there's a correlate if we apply it to organizations. That the core fundamental thing that happens before any movement happens is rooted in the intentionality. And so in this sense, it would be a collective intentionality. And then, organizations, it's a story, as you say, of an evolution, because often an organization starts around a group of people that hold closely a certain intentionality. And then as it gains traction, more people are brought in. And how does that intentionality spread or change or morph or take on entire new lives, right? New CEO comes, boom. He might live out of a whole different worldview. He might see the river that he's steering the boat in entirely different terms than everybody else. So, how do we how do we communicate the quality of our discourse to fuse those horizons is like the parameter of how much everybody is on the same page, sailing the same ship in the same river, right?
Yeah. And sometimes time is of the essence. Doing it, merging those horizons really quickly is essential. So having technology for it as opposed to, I think there's some maybe common sense that says with enough time that happens more or less naturally if the intention is good, and maybe. But we
If you were
rarely
in a
have the
pond,
luxury.
but if you're in a river with a current, I don't know that I think that's really where the time component comes in.
Mhm.
And that, and again, if there's a theme, it's tending the human tendency to want to see things that are in flux as being static. We hire an employee, and the old way is that we think of that employee as a thing and they fit in that place, and that place isn't changing. So it's implied that the employee isn't changing, because here's the job description of what a person in that role does. And usually that's a job description. It's not a developmental agenda necessarily that goes off into the future, but that's the way you need to think, because
That's
pe-
one thing. The developmental agenda for that person is an element. The development of the organization has predictable and unpredictable aspects, and that's also like leaving room for that is essential. I've heard what you just described as kind of the industrial revolution or post-industrial revolution view of the employee, where everybody is best thought of as a machine, and you line up the machines in the right order and you put material through them and you get throughput at you know based on the effectiveness of your machines.
sounds like
And
modernism.
yeah, yeah, right. And then I think organizations, maybe I'm thinking of organizations broadly, right? So governments and companies and communities and religious organizations. And I think Ken Wilber talks about this when he talks about his the various colors in integral theory, right? Spiral dynamics, I think he calls that,
Mhm.
where a red organization is super hierarchical and that's on one end of the spectrum, and then a teal organization is on the far end and that's super egalitarian. And there are examples of self-managed organizations that I've never visited one, so I don't know this firsthand, but I've seen interviews with employees and I've read about them, and there seem to be some self-managed organizations that are highly effective. Individuals set their own compensation. They're absolutely managers, but there aren't bosses. Right? A manager is a member of the team whose responsibility it is to get the rest of the team running smoothly.
Right.
Um, there are developmental agendas for individuals and sub teams and the company as a whole. So this is possible.
Sure.
I've never been in an environment where I felt like it was available.
But you know intuitively, as you describe that, you know intuitively that the quality of the communication of that organization has to be very high.
You know what's interesting is I attribute communication quality to a quality of self-awareness because the biases that color our right view and prevent us from having right view need to get cleared out so that we can communicate effectively about what's subjective and what's objective
Right.
and differentiate them. And
Right.
when people are in a condition of lower maturity and lower self-awareness, they'll confuse the stories they tell themselves for objective reality.
Right. Right.
I might be telling myself, Brian thinks I'm an idiot, and then I'll, um, if I'm not aware that that's just a story, that will absolutely affect how I show up in our conversations and outside of our
Sure. Becomes
conversations.
an interpretive template. Yeah.
So
Yep.
self-awareness is the engine that drives effective communication. But these organizations don't seem to invest necessarily a whole lot in that fundamental layer of self-awareness. They set up processes, and that's why
That presume that.
well, that create it. So,
Okay.
so a compensation committee, for example, you get to pay yourself whatever you want, but you present that to a compensation committee, and that creates some accountability,
Right.
right?
See, that's a sophisticated communication loop compared to the red organization, the
Yeah,
hierarchic organization.
but it's making communication into processes instead of relying on individual self-awareness and individual communication skills to have the nuance and subtlety and directness that are needed to
Right.
make difficult things easy.
But could you see somebody who was really suited to a red quality organization, feeling themselves to have a place in a setting like that?
No, they lose their minds, and
That's what I mean, is
I've
it
never been in a teal.
presupposes a certain level of, yeah,
Yeah.
ability, psychic ability.
Every organization I've been in, I've pushed toward the teal direction. I've never been in a fully egalitarian organization, but I've always been pushing in that direction. And the people who were made very uncomfortable by that sometimes were surprising. You'd think maybe it's generational. No,
Uh-huh.
people the same age as me had much more rigid expectations. Like, I literally had somebody tell me around a conversation like this that what they really wanted in order to be successful was minions. They wanted people who they could tell what to do, and then they would get a huge amount of work done and be successful.
I've had that fantasy too.
Yeah, it would never have worked in the boat, in the river, in the dynamic environment that we exist in.
But you can see the appeal of the fantasy. It's the drive
To
to
It's
totalize.
an adolescent appeal, but
Well,
yes.
it's really an adolescent picture of reality and how things work. But it is, you can see it as a fantasy that, a deterministic kind of fantasy.
That came up a couple of times during this conversation. There's this interplay between totalizing and infinitizing or appreciating the infinity in. um, that's come up a number of times here, and we haven't used those terms. And I was, around speech, around consciousness, around
Right,
organizations and
right.
dynamic environments.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, see, and that's that dialogue, which we mentioned before in other episodes, between the finite, which we can count up and we can do math on, we can run machines on it, we can come up with an answer that's the answer, and then the infinite situations, which is more like what's going to happen tomorrow. And there's all the things that I know, all the scientific truths that I know that I go into tomorrow with. But tomorrow will never be deterministic with all that, armed with all that. It will never become because tomorrow was going to be probabilistic. And then we'll see what happens. And so the organization, our mind wants to live in the deterministic universe. And the idea of totalizing in this sense is that we can totalize, we can do all the math on it.
It's funny, somebody
And then we
said to
can
me just
control it.
today. We can what?
And then we can control it.
Right. Somebody said to me just today, "I don't think I wanna work with this person anymore because they were at work today, and I got home or they were at work yesterday, and I got home at the end of the day, and I was just angry. And when they're not there, I'm not angry. When they are there, I'm angry. And that's the only thing that changed is they were there or they were not there." And my response was maybe, and maybe there's some interesting information there, but it's foolish to pretend that we have any idea about the only thing that changed. Like,
Well, there's that.
everything is
Yeah.
changing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And this idea that you were talking about before, I wanted to bring back to Husserl. This idea that one of the fun things about Husserl is that he also went back to the Greeks. And one of the things that he brought back was this Greek word epoche, Epoche, with the right, epoche. And it gets translated often as bracketing, which is this idea that it's part of the phenomenological reduction that one has to engage in because we don't normally do this. Like, this is what he's trying to get people to do, kind of. And that is this bracketing means that I'm going to take away all of my personal stuff about it, and I'm just going to see it for what it is. And it's this idea that, remember Kant came up with there's the noumena and the phenomena, and we only see the phenomena. The noumena is the thing in itself. Well, there's this idea that there's some transcendental process that we can do by bracketing out all of our, and this is what Lao Tzu is talking about, viewing life with passion or viewing life without passion. So he's saying that we can take ourselves out of the formula and see it somehow bare, see it somehow naked of all the things that we would pile on it by our judgments. And and then you have, of course, people coming after that reacting, saying, you can't do that. You can tell yourself you're doing that, and you may move closer, but you'll never get to the thing in itself, which is, of course, also true. But this idea still that we can, as humans, we still can go through some process. We can't, and this is where the process I would say that discourse, that dialectic helps us to reveal that we can move farther from our own prejudice and into a higher version of what's happening. I'll leave it in those ghostly terms. But that's kind of what he's pointing to. And that's sort of what we're expecting when we want people to play in this higher interdependence. But we have to be able to assume a lot of on the same pageness. And that's the part that I think is really worth unfolding because you can't reproduce it until you can unfold that. And it's along with this idea that there's only really communication between equals.
And along with that, isn't all communication misunderstanding?
Well, it's always got an element of misunderstanding
Yeah.
because the
The
two the
coastline.
two life worlds that it's trying to the horizons of which it's trying to fuse are different. But that's also the significance of the fusing of them
Yeah.
because both models are enhanced thereby. It's like when we connect two computers together by a optic fiber. Now we've really got one big computer with two accessible pieces. Um, and I do think that there, this is the Greeks were the first ones that were onto this. That if we really do have the right nature in our discourse, we will discover new things.
So you said something a few minutes ago that I want to come back to because I liked it and I sort of got it, but I didn't fully get it. What does it mean that consciousness always needs an object to move towards?
Um, this was one of again, one of Husserl's discoveries that I think that we can only come to a deep understanding of this in the first person. And for me, I seem to associate with memories of very early childhood. But the idea is that, the Cartesian picture, I think, of the human was that our awareness was more passive, that we're sort of just there and the apertures are open and all of sensation in the world floods in. And a closer, more phenomenological spelunking into that internal experience reveals, and I do think this is true from my own personal experience, that the mind has to first reach out to the world. It has to look for understanding. It has to look for a thing. That there's something a priori within consciousness, within the knower, within the I, that reaches out to the world first before the perceptions can be metabolized. That the first step of that, not unlike in the hermeneutic circle, the fact that when I pick up this book, I already have some idea of why I picked this book off the shelf and not the ones next to it. It's because somehow it wasn't empty. Unless I closed my eyes and I went, eeny, meeny, and just grabbed it. But still, how did it even get on the bookshelf? And why am I standing in front of this bookshelf? Like there's always this pre stage. That's why Husserl was interested in the pre-philosophical. Before we start to think about things, what's the natural mechanism of our knowing? And the idea is that intentionality reaches out to the world, and it has to run our a priori intuitions on the world. It has to put it in time and space to try to understand it, and that is an act of intent. And then, because it turns out to be, and who did I just see? A quote was saying that everything happens, that evolution is driven by the dialectic between the finite and the infinite. And that's exactly what we've been talking about, right? The finite is what I know, the deterministic principles I try to move into the future with, and the infinite is tomorrow, or what happens when I tell them this at the meeting. Well, we don't know, you know. I didn't know he'd jump out the window. Right? I didn't know they'd make me president of the company. I didn't know that, probabilistic universe, right? So,
I like that.
that's
The
what drives evolution, they said.
what drives evolution is the interaction between the
The
finite and the infinite,
dialectic
the dialectic.
between the finite and the infinite, which is to say, between maybe my known world and my encounter with the other.
Yeah.
My deterministic model meets the infinity of the other, and the other's deterministic model of reality meets my infinity. And so in that fusion of horizons, then in that is a higher level of communication that gets translated out of the German often as mutual understanding. But I don't think it is. I think it's higher than what we mean when we say mutual understanding. It's more than just a meeting of the minds like happens in a contract. Very little of our life worlds have connected for us to just have a contract. Okay, I'll pay you the rent on Friday. That we can still have radically different worlds, and I think that they're talking about this in a much higher sense of ontological we relationship. And by ontological, I mean of the nature of being, of the nature of me being me and you being you on that ontological level. So yeah, and I mean the again, a lot so much is shifted by context. Like, what if the context wasn't a business? What if the context was you've got a group of people and the job is to move into the future? And the idea is to move into the future for the optimal fruitfulness of that group of people.
I mean, I assume you're doing this intentionally, but if you get to first principles with a business, that's what you end up describing. That's it.
As in as in a mission statement.
That's all a business is. I mean, mission statements are overrated because they're very much about the finite and not so much about the infinite. And
Right,
same for
right,
core
right.
values and purpose statements and all that stuff. I don't really see a lot of value in those things, honestly. But I do see value in there being shared understanding that we're a group of people moving forward into the future. Exactly what you said. And how would we like to do that? What does that mean to us?
In an environment, in a
Yeah. Yeah.
context wherein we are the part and it is the whole, the larger whole. Um, and what is the definition of the we relationship and its manifestation through collective actions?
Yeah, that's one of a number of questions to ask, right? Like, what does winning look like? Would be, or
Right.
replace winning with any. I guess that maybe there's a philosophical question there too about how do we characterize moving into the future? Do we think of it as successfully or not successfully, or do we think of it as gracefully and not gracefully, or
How do we know how we're doing?
like, is it how much we learn, how much money we make, how much we grow? Like what I
Right.
mean, grow as mature grow. I don't mean
Yeah. Yeah.
not scale.
Yeah. And what do these widgets have to do with any of that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do these sound bites have to do with any of it?
Right. Well, that might be more direct.
Well, this is an organization. We
Yeah,
are
yeah,
moving into the future. We're very much asking ourselves these questions. And some of them we've asked explicitly and some less so. But, I think that the perspective you and I share so far is we we feel some energy vortex around doing this. We've gotten some anecdotal attaboys from the universe, even though we don't have a huge listening or anything. We've had people
mhm,
say, I really like what you're doing. And
uh-huh,
so we've sort of committed to carry it into the future for a few years and see what becomes of our boat in this river.
right. And but this river is also not an unknown completely, in that we've talked about what do we think's going on with this river and the currents in it, and the role of discourse within this part of this river,
Right.
and with the other boats floating by, which is another interesting, and all contextualized by everything upstream.
The whole play that unfolded and continues to unfold that we were born in the middle of and are still trying to
Right.
figure out who
Yeah.
the
Well,
characters are. Yeah.
that's Heidegger's thrownness. We were literally thrown into this river. We didn't start up at the spring.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was already quite a current.
It was always burning since the world was turning.
Exact today's rock and roll reference.
Hey, I got one.
You got one.
Um, cool. Well, that feels like a point to pause. So yeah, thank you. I enjoyed that conversation. It gave me some food for thought in terms of how I'm thinking about organizational consulting too. So yeah,
Yeah,
hopefully our listeners enjoyed as well.
yeah. Well, and it was an example of metaphorical thought. And that was only one of the metaphors. So it's only one of the models that might yield some interesting things. This is again tied up with this idea of language, because language is fundamentally this thing represents this other thing. And that it is a fundamental for thought. So it is one of the basic tools of thought. So thinking about this, if I was going to be generating oblique strategy cards like from Brian Eno's deck, this would be one of the things that I would be thinking about, is kind of what are the other metaphors I can use on this situation, and what will those metaphors reveal? How will those ways of thinking help me? And this is not ontic. This is more ontological, right? Ontic being we're going to look at the color and the shape and the weight and the see what it is and be very objective. This is the opposite of that. This is what are all the oblique things that might show a facet that hasn't yet been shown by the way that I've thought about this? What if the whole thing was really thought of like one big moose? Or like a big roulette wheel, or like, I mean, literally, it almost doesn't matter because every angle shows an angle like that. And so there's a whole MO here, a whole modus operandi for how to think about things in oblique ways to maybe sniff around for linchpins, you know, realizations that change the context in a way that gives you a new power over the situation, like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fun oblique strategy. Just pulling metaphors out of a hat. And in fact, for any of our listeners that are into kind of practicing expanding the way that they think, just making a practice of that, like do it every day, and you'll find the metaphors come more readily, and the interpretations come more readily, and the insights come more readily, and you get a lot of flow out of that
Yep,
particular approach.
yep. Thinking is metaphorical, which
Yeah.
is why proportion in mathematics was such a huge step. This is to this. We already were relating. This is like this. The way that this thing is to this thing, and a whole other set of things. Well, that's going to be one that we're going to find to be a very key human function, and it's definitely a tool of thought, and it's and a portal to creative thinking, innovative thinking. So
Yeah.
that artists do
There's
this
a
kind of thinking a lot.
maybe a philosophical machine there, or at least a thinking machine.
Yeah, it's a whole
Yeah.
it's a whole category, a whole warehouse of philosophical machines there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Brian.
Sounds good, sir. Have a good day.
You too.
And everyone else. And our listeners, please tell your friends if you've made it this far, then you're to be congratulated, but there might be others like you out there. So seek them out.
Yeah.
And
And thanks to those of you that are telling your friends. I've heard from some of you that's the case.
absolutely,
Appreciate
yes.
it.
Yep. Have a good one, folks.